In this episode, we are going to be taking a look at the Manga Bible by Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. And the reason I'm saying you is because some of you may not realize, but this author, I'm going to just say Siku. If that's wrong, bear with me. But Siku is actually a DiscipleDojo subscriber. Now, I made a post, I think last week or so, that a viewer had sent me a bunch of manga Bibles to look at and check out and wanted to know my thoughts on, wanted me to review them. So this was the first one that I jumped into. And about a quarter of the way through, I just made an offhand post saying, LOL, this thing is a mess. Stay tuned for reviews. And little did I know that the author himself wrote back and said, I'm the author and the artist. This should be interesting. I look forward to your review, whether good or bad. So then I went back and was like, okay, that post probably came off as way more critical than I intended it to. I was basically just talking about something very specific in this that I do believe is a mess, but that doesn't negate this work in its entirety. And so I was actually pretty excited that the creator of this thing watches DiscipleDojo. That's awesome. And as an artist myself, some of you may not know, my 2 undergraduate degrees are in fine art, painting and drawing. And for the first probably 3 to 4 years of art school, my goal, I minored in Japanese in order to eventually move to Japan and study illustration and do graphic novels, manga, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, I didn't go in that direction. God had other plans, but taking a look at this was right in my wheelhouse, and I was happy to do this. And so before we jump into it, of course, you know what I'm going to ask you to do? I'm going to ask you to do something that doesn't cost you anything. Literally, you just tap a button and then you tap another button. And those 2 buttons are the subscribe button and the notifications bell icon. That is the best way you can support this channel and help us continue to grow. It really does make a huge difference. And so thank you to those of you that have subscribed already. Now, first things first. Some people say manga. Some people say manga. I'm American. I believe Siku, the author, is British. I'm not sure if British prefer manga or manga, but in America, you typically hear manga because the word looks like mango, the fruit, only with an A at the end. And so a lot of people say manga. However, in Japanese, it would be manga, the long A sound. I don't really care. I don't even pay attention to which pronunciation I use. I don't care which one you use. I'm not going to be a weeb about it and bemoan anyone who doesn't pronounce it exactly right. But what is manga or manga? What is it? Well, manga is just the Japanese version of what we in America would call comic books. I mean, that's not entirely accurate. American comic strips derived a little bit differently than Japanese manga. And there are some differences. Typically in America, readers tend to look at cartoon or graphic novels or illustrated stories as more for kids. That's just something that American culture has. In Japan, it's not true at all. Manga is written for all ages. There are kids manga, there's superhero manga, there's fantasy manga, there's teenage girl high school drama manga, and everything in between. Now, typically manga are these size. Here is one of my this is actually the final volume in Kinnikuman, which got released in America as Muscles for you 80s kids. You remember, actually, there's some right there. Those are 2 muscle figures. Remember those little pink guys? Well, it's from this Japanese manga series, Kinnikuman, Muscle Man. And a lot of manga have a dust jacket, and they're about this size, like back pocket size. People read them on commutes. They read them in their lunch breaks, on their cigarette breaks. They're everywhere in Japan. And they're not just in Japan. Here is a volume of Dragon Ball Z. And this is actually Chinese, not Japanese, but it's the same thing. And so not all manga is this size. Some of it is collected in hardcover format. Here's volume 1 in a 2-volume edition of my absolute favorite series of all time, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is by Hayao Miyazaki. He went on to found Studio Ghibli. So if you've ever watched Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, My Neighbor Totoro, Porco Rosso, Pompoko, any of those amazing movies, well, this is where Miyazaki got his start. And Nausicaa is this gorgeously illustrated epic tale of this princess of a little country called the Valley of the Wind, caught between these major world powers. And it is like Tolkien-esque in its scope. But this is not a video review of Nausicaa. The only reason I'm even taking this detour is so that you, if you don't know what manga is, you'll at least have a better idea when you come across something like the Manga Bible. So let's talk about the Manga Bible real quick, and then we'll crack open the cover and we'll look at it here on camera. The Manga Bible is an adaptation of the big picture story from Genesis to Revelation, but it's not exhaustive. I mean, if this were exhaustive, if every passage of scripture were illustrated, Siku would still be working on it today, I imagine. So you could think about this as a manga adaptation of stories in the Bible woven together. So let's take a look at it, and I'll talk about some of what I think are the pros and the cons, because here at DiscipleDojo, I do give honest reviews. I'm going to be as fair as possible. The artist graduated from art school, so I know he has had to sit through a number of critiques. And one of the things about art school critiques is you put your work up and people talk about what they think about it, how it makes them feel. They give critiques, they give criticism, but they also give helpful suggestions. It's a time of sharpening. So here we have the cover, you open it up, there's a really cool illustration here, and then there's a note about the authors. So Siku is in charge of the concept and the art, and then Akin is in charge of the script. You have a pretty cool cover page here, and then there's a note, read this first. And so it tells you the Manga Bible is an adaptation of the Holy Bible. It tells the story of God's relationship with his people from the creation of the earth and the early history of the Israelites to the life of Jesus, his death, and the adventures of the first ever church in graphic novel form. It does not claim to tell all the stories or cover all the teaching of the Bible, but is intended to provide a helpful first step to give you, the reader, a taste of the most important themes and characters and a basic idea of what it's all about. The creators and publishers hope that the Manga Bible will inspire you to read more of the full text Bible. So that is a very important caveat right up front, letting the reader know what this is and is not intended to be. And I like that they say that. Now you open up and the first page, the print is very small. This is a compact size. I don't know if this was originally published in a larger format or not, but this one is fairly small. And so some of the print is pretty small as well. But it starts with this phrase, everything's black. And then right here, this kind of confused me for a second. It said, okay, let's do this again. And I didn't know what that was referring to. I was like, wait a minute, is this like some kind of gap theory? Is this God talking about recreating the world after he's already done it? What's going on here? I kept reading, and we have the text of Genesis. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. The Spirit of God moved over the waters, and God said, let there be light. And then you turn the page, zap, there was a light. So then you come to the book of God's people. And I was still wondering, like, what's this? Okay, let's do this again part. So it goes on to give the text of Genesis. It doesn't give all of the creation days. You're just getting these snapshots. Like here's planets forming, here's birds flying, or I guess they're birds. They could be reptile dinosaurs. I don't know. There's the moon here. And then you see this word bubble. It says Moses, Moses. And there's your first clue. You turn the page and Moses is actually surrounded by all of these kids, and he's telling them the creation story. I do believe that that's how the early chapter of Genesis would have been transmitted to the Israelites. I think it would have been told and retold as a story. They would have memorized it word for word. They might have even sung it. So then it jumps to Moses, and he's being approached by Caleb. And here you can see the stylized artwork. So here's Moses right here. But you have Caleb coming up, and what this does is it places the Genesis story within the story of the Torah as the beginning of the covenant and the people of Israel. And I love this decision because reading the Genesis account with all of what we know from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in the back of our mind is very helpful for seeing the connections between the books of the Torah. So then Moses gets back to telling the story, and we zoom in on the account of the first man, Adam. So here you have Adam, and then you have Adam in Eden. And Adam's reply to being in Eden is, cool. There's a little bit of mild nudity, so parents may want to not give this to young kids who will probably just sit and giggle about this instead of actually reading the text. But you have Adam, you've got, the piece taken from his side forms Eve. And some of the pages in this are double pages. So you actually have to read across before going down the page. I got a little confused at times. Sometimes I couldn't tell that the pages were laid out in a spread. And so I'd read here and then here, and it didn't quite make sense. And then I came here and was like, oh, this is all one page. So that's just something to be aware of. Then you have the introduction of the serpent. Now, this is quite prevalent in different traditions, but it's something that's not actually found in the biblical text. You see the serpent has hands, and the serpent uses his hands. And this is part of that tradition that the serpent lost his legs or hands after the fall when God cursed him to crawl on his belly, and that becomes an ideology of why snakes don't have legs. That's all just extra biblical stuff. The word that's used in Hebrew is just the word for serpent or snake. And at no point in the Hebrew mind did serpents or snakes ever have legs. That's just one of those little traditions that finds its way into retellings of the biblical account. So you really see some of the cool artwork in this when you come to, like, for instance, the angel with the flaming sword, the cherubim guarding the entrance of Eden. Now, cherubim were not human figures. They were more animalistic figures, but this is a really cool drawing. And you kind of see Adam and Eve wrapped in their cloak, being expelled from the garden, and the flaming sword. And then you have this depiction of Cain when Cain kills Abel, and this cool, like, hand of sin crouching at the door, like sin wants to take control of Cain. So there's some really neat stylized depictions of things in this. And another example is the enigmatic Nephilim, the sons of God, the daughters of men. Well, in this case, it's this giant armored robot looking guy, almost like Sauron at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, just destroying people. All of this violence and everything. And then that leads up to the story of Noah. And of course, you have the traditional, all the animals coming into the ark up on the hill. Not really sure historically if this is what was going on in that primordial period that Genesis 6 is talking about, but it does make for some cool artwork. Now, sometimes the dialogue is just odd. And I don't know if that's because this was done in the UK and there's just kind of different English than American English, but some of it just landed a little bit weird to me. Like, for instance, here's a story of Joseph. And so, of course, you have Joseph and his fancy coat and then all of his brothers. But there would be what we in America would call mild profanity. Like, I can't stand that freak. Who the hell does he think he is? That's not extreme profanity, but it's just weird dialogue to see in a ancient Near East biblical story. In the next panel, there goes the dreamer. Let's snuff him. So there's some of this like modern slang, which is fine because this is for modern readers, but I don't know, it just struck me as a little odd at times. I did love this illustration of Pharaoh's dream about the skinny cows, and you can see they're like super deformed and distorted, eating all the fat cows and then the grain. That was a pretty cool way to depict that dream. And then when we get to the Exodus, here's a really cool picture of Moses with the tablets and the commandment. It's stylized. It's just a very visually interesting depiction. Here's Moses coming down the mountain. There's the golden calf and all of the people around it. But then there would be inexplicable things written that didn't make sense. Like, for instance, it says Moses had been on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights, receiving 10 instructions from God written on 2 stone tablets. On seeing the idolatry of the Israelites, he snapped. In anger, Moses smashed the tablets. That day, 800 people were killed for their rebellion against God. But if you read Exodus 32:28, it says 3,000 people. So I don't know if this is a typo or just a mistake, but at this event in Exodus chapter 32, the number is 3,000 people, not 800 people. Now, throughout, the artist does a great job of putting in these kind of maps so you can see where the action is taking place. So this is the Salt Sea, which is actually the Dead Sea, and then the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean. And so the action is taking place here in the Transjordan because these are the events of the book of Numbers. But then you have other stuff that's just wild. Like, here is King Og of Bashan, and he's attacking with this giant chain, and he's this massive man. And then you have, somebody, I guess it's God, I don't know who's saying, don't be afraid of the giant, Moses. His arms are too short to fight with God. Maybe that's Joshua talking, or maybe it's the Lord. I don't know. It's just kind of coming from out of nowhere. And then you have Moses stabbing him through with a spear. So in Numbers 21, it was the Israelites that defeated King Og and his army. Probably not Moses jamming a spear through a giant. Because remember, Moses is about 120 years old at this point. Now, throughout this, sometimes they will present books or sections as a standalone little, almost either a cartoon or something like kind of humorous. And so you see that with Job here. It's just called The Story of Human Suffering. And it just gives a brief account. He lost everything. And then for some reason, there's the bomb that was dropped on Japan in World War II, the Fat Man. This was the bomb that was dropped on, I believe, Hiroshima. So I'm not sure what this is doing in a story of Job. And then you have his wife actually saying, curse you, Job. But his wife, I believe, was telling Job to curse God, not cursing Job. But maybe she, at some point, and then you have Job's friends coming along, and one of them's in a business suit. So this is kind of putting Job in a modern setting, which is okay because Job is one of the books of the Hebrew Bible that is somewhat timeless, but there's no mention in any of this of the accuser coming before God and the sort of wager that God makes about Job. There's really none of the depth of what Job was complaining about and what his friends were rebuking him for. So it's bare bones. I guess if you could summarize, 40 chapters of a book on one page, that's a tall order for anybody to be able to do. I don't know. As a summary of Job, I don't love this, I got to say. And now we're coming to Joshua, and Joshua's depicted pretty cool. He's got dreadlocks and, armed for battle. But then again, here's some of this weird slang. You have Joshua looking at all of the troops, all of the people of Israel, and he says, I don't know about you guys, but I hate long speeches, so I'll get straight to the point. In 3 days, we crossed the River Jordan to pick a fight. Those not in favor, tough. You ain't got a choice. This is the same Joshua who said, choose this day who you will serve. So it's just a weird, again, the portrayal of the language doesn't seem to match the mood of the text. But the artwork is gorgeous. And then throughout the conquest, here's, again, a beautiful illustration of the king of Hatzor, King Jabin, coming out. But, none of this is almost like Conan the Barbarian type fantasy setting, Lord of the Rings, not ancient Near East in Canaan, but it does look visually cool. That's a cool looking image of a battle. Then there's sort of a standalone story of Ruth, and it summarizes what Naomi lost in Moab, and then she returns and Ruth returns with her. And you have Boaz coming out and showing her kindness. Now in the text, Boaz tells his workers, hey, let her come and glean even among the standing sheaves of grain. And he tells his workers, in fact, take some of it out and leave it for her, like give her extra, put it on the ground and let her come along and get it. But in this text, he has Boaz saying to them, don't stop her, even if she steals grain from where it's stacked, and don't speak harshly to her. So that's just a weird choice. A emphasis in the Boaz account and his showing kindness to Ruth was that he was telling his workers, take out some of the extra and give it to her. So here you have it seem like he's just turning a blind eye while she steals from him. So that was just that's a weird choice. As was the fact that for some reason, Naomi and Ruth have a pet Pokemon. So later we're coming to Elijah. And again, you see an example of one of these cool maps that sort of situates the reader so you know where in the world the text is taking place. There's a kind of a cool introduction to Elijah. And this is a really gorgeous, very simple and stylized depiction. Again, nothing at all what Elijah probably would have looked like, but that's just cool artwork. He has his encounter, God sends down fire, the prophets of Baal are destroyed. And then we come to another one of these standalones of the book of Jonah. And this one's funny. In the back of this, there's an interview with Sekou and Akin where they're just kind of talking about how some of the passages developed. And they talk about the Jonah account. And it's meant to be comical. Like they're depicted very cartoonish, you have Jonah. He doesn't look like a Hebrew prophet. He looks like this sort of cartoony picture. You even have the fish coming up and just gulp. swallowing him up. But again, you have this inexplicable writing where when the storm comes on the sea, you have the sailors, they cry out, help, save us, O gods. And then you have the sailors saying, the bald guy, it's his fault. And Jonah is saying, oops. And they say, because you ran away from your God, you have brought this disaster on us. And so they throw him overboard. In the Jonah account, part of the irony of the book of Jonah is that the sailors did not want to throw Jonah overboard. Jonah made them throw him overboard. And they ended up crying out to God and had this sort of proto-salvific encounter. And then after God doesn't destroy Nineveh, so the fish swallows him, spits him out, he goes to Nineveh, he proclaims it. And then you have Jonah, being mad, which is true to the text. And then we come to the end of the Old Testament section, and Israel's taken into captivity, and then they return from captivity. So again, you have a map showing you what's going on. There's sort of a restoration, they're rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. This is a really cool illustration. And I love what they do. It says there was one last promise yet to be kept. So God had brought them back, but the story is incomplete. And then the next page talks about how Moses had promised that there would be a prophet that God would raise them up after all of this. And then it says, but that would take another 400 years. And then the end of the Old Testament section. So it really does end setting you up for the rest of it. So it does a good job of tying the Old Testament into what's going to come in the New Testament. And then you go into the Gospels. And once again, you have some odd choices. One, I love the way Herod's depicted. That's not only funny and maniacal, but that's very, very manga-esque. But then you have the wise men coming and they encounter the baby, and Herod says, go tell me where he is so I can come and worship him. And then you have the wise man saying to Joseph and Mary, flee, escape to Egypt. Herod will try to kill the boy. And I don't know why they had the wise men say this, because the wise men don't. It's not the wise men who warn Joseph and Mary. It's an angel of the Lord after the wise men leave. And then later on, you have John the Baptist here, and he looks very rough and wild like John the Baptist would, yelling at people and pointing to Jesus. And then you have Jesus coming up and asking to be baptized, and the Spirit coming down on him, and then being tempted in the wilderness. And you have Satan is depicted as this kind of shadowy figure, tempting Jesus, showing him the kingdoms of the earth. And in this one, he's showing him New York City. You have Jesus' encounter with a demoniac and a very dramatic exorcism, getting out on the boat, preaching in the Sea of Galilee to the crowds on the shore. And then the parables are presented in this, again, sort of cartoony way. Like here you have the man going up to Jerusalem from Jericho, and then he's attacked, left for dead. You have the priest walking to the other side, but he calls them in this, instead of the priest, he's called a vicar. And then instead of a Levite, he's called a choir master. So vicar is definitely something that you hear in the UK more than in the US. And then you have the Samaritan coming along and taking him. And just the way it's done, very different feel to the rest of the stories. They do this with the parables to kind of set them out. It reminded me of the movie The Miracle Maker, which is all done in 3D claymation. But then whenever Jesus tells a parable or there's a flashback, it switches to 2D animation. It's a very cool effect. And I actually really like that decision to do with the parables in this. You see it again in the parable of the unforgiving servant. And this time, you have the setting is like this mobster boss. And so this guy owes him $100,000. And the guy says, oh, I got to feed my family. He's like, all right, we're square. You're good. And then the guy goes out and another guy owes him 1,000. And, the parable is he doesn't forgive him. And so then the boss calls him back in and has his goons drag him away and rough him up. And even names him Frankie Two-Face. So definitely not culturally accurate to the New Testament, but a really fun way of presenting the parable in a modern, timeless way. And you have Jesus entering the temple and the money changers are there and he makes a whip of cords. Now it does embellish this, the text says Jesus squared up to the 10,000 temple guards, traders, money changers, and pilgrims and let rip. So definitely embellishing the story, but it does look cool. There's a really gorgeous illustration of the crucifixion. Again, not biblically or anatomically accurate, but very striking. That's well done artistically. But then you have a weird choice where Jesus appears to his disciples sort of in the upper room, which is what happens in one account. And then later he appeared to them all on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. But this sort of conflates those into one instance. And what's really odd is Jesus, he appears and he says, "Greetings, it's me, your master. You look like you've seen a ghost. I can assure you I am real. Look at the nail holes in my hands and my feet. So far, so good." Then he says, "By the way, I'm starving. Do you have any food? I could murder some fish and honeycomb." Now, Jesus did eat with his disciples, and that is part of how they knew that he wasn't a ghost or a spirit. But I think it's going a little beyond that to have Jesus say, "I'm starving," as if the resurrected Lord needed to eat. Is just a weird writing choice. Then it moves into the book of Acts. So Jesus ascends, his followers are there, the Holy Spirit comes upon them. This is where I thought there would be some drawing of like this cool fire coming down on the heads of the disciples. But instead, you've just sort of got this sketch of them with this light, and then they're ready to start preaching. So it's an odd choice. I don't know why. I mean, Pentecost is a pretty cool thing if you're going to graphically illustrate something. Just an odd choice to leave that out. You have Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. That's pretty cool. And then you have Paul, when it comes to the epistles, how do you illustrate the New Testament? Because after Acts, there's really no more narrative. It's all letters. And I like the way they did this. They have Paul sort of dictating his letters to Tertius, his scribe. And they even give some nods to some things that I think are pretty plausible. It's got someone saying, "Paul, the Corinthian brethren are here." And then you have Paul saying, "Ha, a sight for sore, bored, and deteriorating eyes. It's great to see you guys. You look well." And that's a nod to what many scholars think was wrong with Paul, that he had something wrong with his eyes, and that possibly that's what he was referring to with his thorn in the flesh comment, which we've talked about here on DiscipleDojo and done a deep dive on that particular passage. So all of this has led a number of New Testament scholars to think that Paul had problems with his eyesight, and that's a little nod to that. And then you have him dictating to Tertius what's going to be his letter to the Corinthians. And then you have sort of excerpts of the Corinthian letter being read to or read by the Corinthians in different settings, showing how Paul's letters would have circulated. You have Paul dictating his letter to the Romans. Then you have Paul talking about the situation among the Galatians and the false teachers, the Judaizers coming in, and even Peter sort of being taken into their teaching and Paul having to rebuke him, and then the other apostles eventually agreeing with Paul. This is a cool picture of Galatians, and it goes with the passage, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" And this is presenting the false teachers as coming in and presenting a false gospel to lead the Galatians astray. I like this a lot. This is really cool. It's not culturally accurate or physically, literally accurate, but it encapsulates the spirit of false teachers that Paul is warning against. These people who come and prey on the flocks that he's been tending. And then after Paul's letters, there's nothing of the general epistles, which was understandable, but also a little disappointing. Then it comes to Revelation, and it starts with a little girl in a hospital room reading the book of Revelation in the New Testament, falling asleep. Either her name is Petra or she's wearing a t-shirt of maybe the 80s hair metal Christian band Petra. And she falls asleep and she starts to dream, and she dreams the book of Revelation. And it doesn't go into a lot of detail. It sort of lays out in this kaleidoscopic form the different images of Revelation and then how the book ends. After this, there's some commentary on key scenes by the author and the artist where they discuss the decisions they made and some of the texts. And then there are some concept sketches at the back. And then it closes with a note to the reader about the importance of the biblical story as a story for all of humanity, the grand story, and God is the hero. And at the very end, there's a glossary of a few terms that get used that readers may or may not know. And that's it. So that is the Manga Bible. I want to share what I think are pros and what I think are cons. I'm going to start with the pros. The artwork is gorgeous. I can tell Saku is a very gifted and talented artist, even in the stylized choices, even in some of the scenes that looked a little more unfinished or raw. The conveying of emotion, visual energy, mood, I think that was done well. If I had to critique the art From a purely artistic perspective, I would say sometimes the scenes are a little hard to follow visually on the page. Sometimes they're a little too cluttered. They're a little more modern graphic design, haphazard than traditional linear storytelling. And for some people, that's just visually a little more confusing. That's really my only critique of the art as art. I think it's wonderful art. I also love that the whole Bible is presented as a grand story. It doesn't depict each book as a separate thing. It doesn't put a huge break between Old Testament and New Testament. It presents the meta-narrative, and I like that. I think that's a great way to teach the story of Scripture, what Christopher Wright calls the mission of God, the grand narrative of the Bible. I really did like that. I love the way they bled the Old Testament right into the New Testament, showing the unfinished nature of the Old Testament and how the New Testament picks right up on that. I also loved the presentation of the parables, Jonah, even Job. I didn't love the content of how Job was handled. I thought that was pretty lacking, but the fact that it was presented as sort of a standalone, timeless story, as was Jonah, theologically, I like that choice. I just think it could have been executed a little better in terms of the content. I also like that Revelation was presented as sort of this haphazard dreamscape. I think that's a good way to visually present the book of Revelation if you can't go through it verse by verse. I like that they didn't try to identify modern things with Revelation, and you have, Apache helicopters and nuclear bombs as the things that John's seeing in Revelation. I like that, actually. I liked how they handled the epistles. How do you illustrate Paul dictating something to his scribe? That's a challenge for any graphic designer, any illustrator. And I think they handled it pretty well. I would like to have seen more of the other epistles. There's more stuff in the New Testament besides just Paul's writings. Maybe have James preaching his sermon and how that became the book of James, or the author of Hebrews and some of the imagery from the tabernacle and the priesthood and all the stuff that the author of Hebrews draws from. There are things that could be done with the other epistles in this style pretty effectively, I think. But for what they included, I think Saku did a really good job. I thought putting the maps into the text in a stylized way where it sort of looks like you're looking down, almost like satellite imagery. I thought that was really cool, labeling the place names. And I did love that throughout there were these little boxes in the corners or on the side of the pages that say, "Want to know more?" And then it would give the actual scripture where the events were pulled from. That is fantastic. But let me be fair and give some criticisms that don't have to do with the artwork, but that are more focused on the substance. I think what I initially shared in my post last week, in terms of how this depicts the ancient Near East, I think it's a mess. I think you've got people that look like everything from Vikings to mech warriors. You have 100-and-something-year-old Moses looking like a 30-something-year-old golden bearded flowing angelic figure. Almost nobody in this, at least in the Old Testament section, had beards, which is just out of place because that's one of the things we know about Hebrew culture is they were not clean shaven like the Egyptians. The landscapes, as beautiful as they were, there was a lot of imagery in this that reminded me of Mobius, these ethereal, almost architectural depictions of cities, but they were massive. I mean, you had Jericho looking like a 50-story skyscraper size city, something that's almost futuristic. And visually, it looks really cool. So I'm not knocking the art. Just from a biblical Old Testament guy perspective, it really took me out of the biblical world. I would love to see this skill of artistry applied in a way that was controlled by cultural accuracy, I think. Less Conan and more Canaan. I think that would be my biggest critique, particularly of the Old Testament. It's not quite as bad in the New Testament, but as an Old Testament guy, it just felt weird reading it. Some of the slang, again, felt really out of place. I mean, one scene in particular where the midwives are not going to carry out the order of Pharaoh to throw all the male children into the Nile, and they're saying when the order is given, "I sure ain't killing no baby. Hell no. Preach it, sister." That's just weird. I don't know. I just thought that was bad dialogue. Borderline profanity aside, I just think it doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit in an ancient Near East context, and it's almost this stylized gospel slang. I just didn't like that part. So some of that stuff, some of the small biblical errors, like having the wise men telling Joseph to flee to Egypt, or saying that 800 people were killed instead of 3,000. There were just a number of biblical theological errors. So I don't know who the scholarly insight, or, usually when there's a project like this, you'll get somebody who's either a biblical scholar, an ancient historian, you get somebody to sort of come in as a consultant. In the beginning introduction, Siku does acknowledge his gratitude to the London School of Theology, and that this was somewhat part of his dissertation. So there was scholarly insight. And maybe there are scholars that could make a case for some of the things that to me seem like errors. And it's not like they're rampant and everywhere through it, but they just kind of stuck out to me as I was reading, like, oh, wait, what? So those are my honest critiques as a Bible nerd. But the question at the end of the day is, would I recommend the Manga Bible? Obviously not as a study Bible. It doesn't even claim to be that. I think for what it claims to be, what the creators specifically say it is to be in the beginning introduction, I think it's exactly that. The fact that they included those want to know more and then gave you the Bible verses on the pages, that makes me comfortable recommending this to someone, because this is sort of an appetizer for the Bible story. And if you look at it that way and you read it that way, I think it's great. I think it can present some discussions. I think if you have I would not recommend this for elementary school. I would say upper middle school to high school would be the primary audience for this. Not something that I would read with little kids, obviously, but using this as a jumping off point for a Bible study, reading this and then reading this text in scripture that's listed in the margin, I could see that being really helpful. So yeah, do I have some qualms with some of the specific decisions made? Of course I do. Do I think this is quality? Yeah, I think it is. Do I think it's a helpful tool for engaging and getting people interested in the biblical text? Yeah, especially if they're interested in manga, especially if they like graphic design and illustration. Unlike some other comic adaptations of the Bible, the art in this is very good. So yeah, historically, culturally, I still think it's a mess. And I say that not as condemnation or slamming it, but just as honest critique. However, I don't think that overrides how good it is. And I do think this is worth taking a look at. So those are my candid and honest thoughts on the Manga Bible. If you have used it, if you have read it, if you have looked at it, I'd love to hear yours. What do you think? Am I way off base? Am I wrong in some of my critiques of the Manga Bible? Let me know in the comments below. I'm completely open to hearing that. And again, I appreciate Siku commenting on the channel and saying that he was open to hearing critique. That's what good artists and good theologians should always welcome, when it's done in a spirit of generosity and respect. And hopefully this review is received in a spirit of generosity and respect, because that's my intention. So that's all for this one. Stay tuned. We're going to be looking at other manga related Bible resources. In the meantime, subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, keep training.